behind an unmarked cave mouth in the Belizean jungle waits a chamber that swallowed 18 people whole and buried the reason why for over 1,000 years. For 50 years, the textbook answer for why the classic Maya vanished was a shrug. A rock pulled from a second Belizean cave can now date that collapse almost to the year. A few miles away, the museum placard gives tourists the shrug version. Douglas Kennett spent a year training students to drill into that rock before anyone knew what it would prove. In 2006, deep inside Yokbalum Cave, it paid off. That chamber has a name. Archaeologists call it Acton Tunachil Muknal, ATM for short, and it holds one skeleton in particular that gives the site its nickname. Fused to the cave floor by centuries of dripping limestone, glittering like it was cast in crystal, she is known simply as the Crystal Maiden. The Maya believed caves like this one were doors into the underworld. Around her, in the dark, there are 17 more people. Their bones are scattered across a gallery half a kilometer inside the earth, a space nearly the size of a football field, ceilings vanishing into black overhead. Some skulls show blunt force trauma. Some belong to children. A few were shaped in infancy, the skull bound and flattened into the elongated form Maya elites prized as beautiful. Around them sit close to 1,500 pots, bowls, and ceremonial tools, untouched since the day they were placed there. Nobody looted this cave. Nobody found it for over 1,000 years. Not until 1989, when a geomorphologist named Thomas Miller pushed further into the passage than anyone before him. Serious excavation didn't begin until the mid-1990s, when Belizean archaeologist Jamie Awe followed a colleague's vague directions. Walk up the stream, there's a cave there, and found a ceremonial chamber sealed since the Maya themselves last visited it. The pottery styles pin the worst of what happened here to one narrow window, roughly 700 to 900 AD. That is not a random date. That is the exact century the classic Maya world was supposed to be falling apart. Here's the story people have been told for generations. The classic Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Cities like Tikal, Copan, and Caracal, with pyramids taller than church steeples, a writing system carved into stone, and an astronomical calendar accurate enough to track the orbit of Venus for centuries without a telescope. At its peak, the region held some of the highest population densities anywhere in the pre-industrial Americas, cities of tens of thousands supported by raised fields and engineered reservoirs. Then across roughly 150 years, it stopped. Kings stopped commissioning monuments. Cities emptied. The jungle folded back over plazas that had held thousands of people, swallowing staircases and temples so completely that early European explorers mistook them for natural hills. For half a century, historians have argued about why, and the debate always circled back to the same short list: overpopulation, soil exhaustion, warfare between rival kings, drought. Everyone had a favorite theory. Nobody had proof precise enough to settle it. That is the story the world accepted. And it is the story that a small formation of calcite pulled out of a cave in southern Belize was about to complicate. That's the rock from the beginning of this story. It came out of a cave called Yokbalum in the hills of Toledo district, less than 2 miles from the ruins of a classic Maya city called Uxbenca, and within roughly 200 kilometers of Tikal, Copan, and Caracal, close enough that all of them sat under the same rain clouds. The cave itself is a single trunk passage with an entrance at each end, which means constant airflow moves through it, keeping conditions stable enough for a mineral record to grow undisturbed for thousands of years. Kennett, then at Pennsylvania State University, wasn't hunting treasure. He was hunting something most people would walk straight past: a stalagmite, one of the slow, dripping mineral columns that grow on cave floors, layer by layer, over thousands of years. He later described what it took to get it out: students working 20 to 30 hours a week for a year, hauling equipment through an unmapped stretch of the cave, carrying the sample out by headlamp through narrow, craggy passages most tourists will never see. What they were carrying was small, barely 2 feet long. What was locked inside it was enormous. A stalagmite grows in layers like a tree trunk turned upside down, one microscopic ring at a time, built from water dripping through rock above it. The chemistry of each layer records the rainfall that fell the year it formed. Kennett's team sliced their sample and took more than 4,200 separate oxygen isotope measurements, spaced 1/10 of a millimeter apart, then dated the layers using uranium-thorium decay, a radiometric clock accurate here to within about 17 years, a rounding error compared to the century-wide uncertainty that had haunted earlier climate studies. That gave them a rainfall record accurate to roughly every 6 months, stretching back to around 40 BC. No lake sediment, no tree ring, nothing else recovered from the Maya world came close to that resolution. This wasn't a guess about ancient weather. It was closer to a 2,000-year weather diary, written in stone, and nobody had thought to read it until now. A follow-up analysis of the same stalagmite published in 2023 added a detail that made the picture even less comfortable. It wasn't just that the rain declined. Between roughly 700 and 800 AD, the rainy season itself became less predictable, arriving early some years and late in others, which is arguably worse for a farming economy than a straightforward drought. You can plan around scarcity, but you cannot plan around chaos. What the stalagmite showed was published in Science in 2012, and it reframed the entire debate. Between roughly 440 and 660 AD, the region saw an unusually wet, stable climate rainfall, high enough to support explosive population growth and fuel the rise of cities like Tikal, Köpen, and Karakol. Then, starting around 660 AD, the rain began to fail, not all at once. A long, uneven drying trend stretched out over the next 3.5 centuries, interrupted by severe multi-decade droughts clustered around 820 to 870 AD and again from 1020 to 1100 AD. The second one coinciding almost exactly with the final abandonment of southern Belize. Kennett put it in blunt terms. The earlier centuries of abundant rain had been a trap. A society built its cities, its farms, and its politics around water that seemed permanent. Then the water stopped being permanent, and nobody had planned for that. Here is where it stopped being just a climate story. Kennett's team cross-referenced their rainfall curve against a database of dated stone monuments, thousands of inscriptions recording wars, captive takings, alliances, and the rate at which kings commissioned new stelae to boast about their reigns. They built what amounts to a war index, tracked year by year against the drought record, and the two lines moved together. As the rain declined, conflict rose. Political violence didn't spike randomly across the Maya lowlands. It tracked the drying climate, kingdom by kingdom, almost like watching a fuse burn down the map. That correlation is one of the most cited findings in Maya archaeology, and it is the reason a rock pulled out of a cave floor can sit at the center of a documentary about the fall of an empire. Put actual dates next to that correlation and it gets harder to dismiss as coincidence. Tikal's last dated stela was carved in 869 AD. The last long count date anywhere in the Maya lowlands, a monument at the site of Tonina, was carved on January 15th, 909 AD, and after that, silence. No new monuments, no new kings boasting in stone. Karakol, the largest classic Maya city in what is now Belize, a metropolis with no permanent river running through its 200 square kilometers of territory, lingered on with a shrinking population before its final abandonment around 1050 AD, a city with zero natural water security, holding on the longest it could in exactly the pattern you'd expect if drought, not conquest, was the deciding pressure. Every one of those dates sits inside the drying trend the stalagmite already mapped. But a correlation between rain and war doesn't explain the 18 bodies in Acton-Tunachil-Muknal. For that, you need a second Belizean site and a second scientist willing to dive into the dark. Her name is Lisa Lucero, a University of Illinois archaeologist who has spent close to 2 decades directing fieldwork at a place called Cara Blanca, 25 pools and cenotes strung along a limestone escarpment in central Belize, several plunging more than 60 meters straight down into water black enough to swallow a headlamp beam whole. Divers, working with co-investigator Andrew Kinkella, have explored only 8 of the 25. One pool, simply named Pool 1, sits beside the fallen remains of a terminal classic structure archaeologists now call a water temple, originally 6 to 8 rooms, built right at the edge of a sinkhole with no visible bottom, teetering there for over 1,000 years. What Lucero's team pulled out of that pool tells its own story about the drought years. Pots, jars, bowls, stone tools, fossilized teeth and claws, offerings, thrown or lowered into the water, as gifts to Chalk, the Maya rain god. The early layers of offerings are sparse, ordinary, the kind of routine tribute you'd expect from any prosperous religious site. Then, in the period stretching roughly from 800 to 900 AD, the offerings intensify sharply. More pots, more elaborate vessels, more frequent visits, layered one on top of another, like a congregation returning again and again with the same unanswered prayer. National Geographic, reporting on the excavation, called it a drought cult, a term that sounds almost too dramatic until you notice the timing. The Maya were not passively watching their world dry out. They were making pilgrimages, in growing numbers, to beg a god for rain in the exact years the stalagmite 200 kilometers away says the rain had already failed. It didn't work. The region around Cara Blanca was eventually abandoned, the water temple left standing on the edge of a pool that had stopped answering. And this is where the story turns uncomfortable because the offerings weren't always objects. There is a third stalagmite record worth knowing about, pulled from a cave called Makal Chasm on the Vaca Plateau, stretching back more than 3,000 years, and later extended to over 5,000. Its most prolonged dry stretch in the entire record lands squarely between 750 and 900 AD, a third independent confirmation from a third cave that the drying trend wasn't a fluke of one stalagmite in one location. And roughly 40 kilometers from Yok Balum, in a limestone system now called Chechem Ha, archaeologist Yemi Awe and colleagues found the same pattern Lucero found at Cara Blanca, cave ritual activity spiking in the late Classic period, timed almost exactly to the drying trend the stalagmites had already documented. They called their 2009 paper on the subject The Ancient Maya Drought Cult, and the title wasn't an exaggeration. In a river cave called Barton Creek, reachable only by canoe, researchers found the remains of at least 28 people laid across 10 natural ledges, spanning several centuries of ritual burial, alongside hearths and stone tools that suggest repeated, sustained use rather than a single event. And in 2006, in a cave that would later earn the name Midnight Terror, a field team under awe recovered more than 9,500 human bones and fragments, a minimum of 118 individuals, one of the largest sacrificial deposits ever documented in the Maya lowlands. A later study of the remains found that children made up over 40% of that assemblage, most of them between 5 and 10 years old. That number should stop you for a second, because it means that as the drought worsened, the offerings the Maya were willing to make worsened with it. So by the time you step back into Acton-Tunachil-Muknal and look at the crystal maiden fused into the floor, the picture is no longer isolated. It fits a pattern documented across half a dozen caves in Belize. As the stalagmites recorded declining rainfall, the archaeology inside the caves recorded escalating desperation. The 18 bodies in that chamber are not simply victims of a mysterious ritual. They are very possibly evidence of a civilization trying everything it knew to survive a crisis that a piece of rock buried a mile away had already time-stamped to the year. There's a detail worth sitting with here, though, because it complicates the neat version of this story. The Crystal Maiden's sex has never been conclusively confirmed. For years, she was described as a teenage girl, roughly 17 to 20 years old. More recent examination has raised the possibility that the skeleton actually belongs to a young man. The signature injury isn't a crushed skull like several others in the chamber. It's 2 crushed vertebrae, a different kind of violence that researchers still can't fully explain. The nickname stuck decades before the science caught up with it, and now nobody wants to be the one who has to correct a legend that famous. Before we go further into the caves, it's worth asking an obvious question. How did anyone know to look for droughts in the first place? For most of the 20th century, nobody was looking at rain at all. Archaeologists like T. Patrick Colbert pointed to overpopulation and soil exhaustion, too many mouths, too little arable land. Others, following excavations led by Arthur Demarest in the Pitex-Batoon region, pointed to escalating warfare between rival dynasties, cities building defensive walls in their final decades. Jared Diamond later folded both into a broader argument about societies that outgrow their environment and collapse under their own weight. Each theory had real evidence behind it. None of them had a precise clock. That's what was missing, and that's exactly what the climate explanation eventually supplied, starting decades before Yoke Balaam, with a much cruder tool than a stalagmite: mud. In 1995, researchers led by David Hodel drilled sediment cores out of Lake Chichancanab in the Yucatan and found the first hard evidence of a severe drought coinciding with the Terminal Classic period, published in Nature. It was a breakthrough, but a blunt one. Lake mud gives you decades of resolution, not years, and it can't easily be tied to a specific king, a specific war, a specific stela. Then in 2003, a team led by geochemist Gerald Hogg analyzed sediment from the Cariaco Basin off the coast of Venezuela, nowhere near the Maya world, but recording the same regional climate system, and dated intense multi-year droughts to roughly 810, 860, and 910 AD, sitting inside a longer dry stretch running from about 760 to 930. That paper, published in Science, was the first to put precise-sounding dates next to the idea that climate had killed a civilization, and it made headlines around the world. Then, in 2012, the same year as the Yuck Balloon paper, a second team led by climate scientist Martin Medina Elizalde used a stalagmite from Grutas Sabna in the Yucatan to model exactly how much rainfall the Maya lowlands lost during the collapse. Their answer as little as 25 to 40% less annual rain, with the sharpest cuts landing during the crucial summer growing season. That is not an apocalyptic drop. It's the kind of number that sounds almost survivable, until you remember the Yucatan has no rivers. Every drop of water the Maya used came from rain, funneled into reservoirs they had engineered themselves. Take away a quarter to a third of that rain for a century and a half, and the engineering that built the empire becomes the engineering that starves it. Co-author Ilko Rolling, discussing the findings, was careful to draw a line the headlines kept erasing. We are not saying that climate ended the ancient Mayan civilization. A 25% drop in rain doesn't burn a city down. It doesn't storm a palace. What it does is quieter and, in some ways, more disturbing. It removes the margin a society needs to absorb a bad harvest, a border dispute, a succession crisis. The drought didn't have to kill the Maya directly. It just had to make every other problem unsurvivable at the same time. That should have settled the debate once and for all. Given how precise the numbers sounded, it didn't, not even close, because not every Maya city collapsed, not even close. In 2007, archaeologist James Amers published a paper with a title that still stings anyone pushing a tidy climate narrative: What Maya Collapse? His argument was blunt, and it landed exactly where the drought theory was weakest. Some cities in the supposedly drought-stricken lowlands never collapsed at all. Lamine, in northern Belize remained continuously occupied straight through the Terminal Classic and deep into the colonial period. Its temples still standing and its population still farming centuries after Tikal's monuments went silent for good. Amers' challenge was simple and hard to answer. If a single regional mega drought ended the classic Maya world, explain Lamanai. Explain every city that kept building, kept trading, kept carving new monuments while its neighbors, a few days' walk away, emptied out entirely. A drought severe enough to end an empire should not have been polite enough to skip certain neighborhoods. There's also a quieter problem buried in the methodology, one that rarely makes the headlines and almost never makes the documentaries. Most of the highest resolution drought records, including Cariaco, Chichancanab, and the Zabna stalagmite, come from the northern Yucatan, or, in Cariaco's case, an entirely different country, hundreds of miles from any Maya city. The southern lowlands, where population collapse hit hardest and where cities like Tikal and Caracal stood, still have relatively few high-resolution climate records of their own. Yokbalam and the McCall Chasm stalagmite are among the rare exceptions, sitting inside the disaster zone itself rather than beside it. Which means, for years, the strongest version of the climate story was being told largely by proxies, standing just outside the room where the worst of it actually happened, close enough to be convincing, not quite close enough to be conclusive. Kennett himself has never claimed drought alone explains the collapse, and it's worth being precise about that, because it's the difference between honest science and a headline built to get clicks. His argument has always been about interaction, rainfall, abundance fueling population growth, and political competition during the good centuries, then rainfall scarcity turning that same competition lethal once the good centuries ended. Climate didn't replace the old explanations that Colbert and Demarest had spent careers building. It gave them a mechanism, a clock, and in some cases an alibi. The warfare was real. The overpopulation was real. The soil exhaustion was real. The drought is what made all three catastrophic at the same moment, across dozens of independent kingdoms that otherwise had no reason to fail in sync, on the same rough timeline within a few generations of each other. So if the case wasn't fully closed in 2012, and it still wasn't closed after Amers, and it still wasn't closed after a decade of follow-up studies, what changed in the years since to make anyone claim this cave discovery could finally solve it? In August 2025, a team led by climate scientist Daniel James, working out of the University of Cambridge, published a study in Science Advances that pushed the resolution of Maya drought reconstruction further than anyone had managed before, and notably, some of the same names from the original Yokbalam team, including Kennett's collaborators James Baldini and Sebastian Breitenbach, worked on it too. The network chasing this mystery had never really stopped. Using a different stalagmite from the same Zabna cave system, this one labeled Zob 06-1, the team resolved individual wet and dry seasons, one at a time, across 150 years stretching from 871 to 1021 AD. Not decades, not even single years. Seasons. For the first time, researchers could see exactly how long a specific drought lasted, wet season by wet season, almost to the month. What they found was worse than the earlier studies suggested. 8 separate droughts, each lasting at least 3 years. And one of them, dated to roughly 929 to 942 AD, lasted 13 years straight. 13 years without a normal wet season, in a civilization that depended entirely on that season to fill its reservoirs and grow its corn. James put the human cost in plain language. During the worst stretches of prolonged, severe drought, stone inscriptions at sites like Chichen Itza simply stopped, not slowed down, stopped. As James described it, the kings and scribes likely had more urgent things to worry about than commissioning monuments like whether the crops they depended on were going to survive the season, 13 years. Sit with that number for a moment. It is longer than most human childhoods. Long enough for an entire generation to grow up, never knowing what a reliable harvest felt like, never tasting a normal wet season, never hearing their parents describe rain the way older generations remembered it. Long enough for a water temple on the edge of a Belizean cenote to go from occasional offerings to something closer to a shrine of last resort, and long enough for a cave floor to start collecting more bodies than pots. The stalagmite that made this possible sat in absolute darkness for over 1,000 years, recording a catastrophe nobody was there to read, layer by microscopic layer, until a research team with a coring drill and a decade of patience finally asked it the right question. The same year, a very different kind of scanning was happening back at Acton Tunachil Muknal, not of rock, but of the cave itself. Since a tourist's dropped camera cracked a skull inside the main chamber, in 2012, cameras and phones have been banned from the site entirely. Visitors are capped at 125 a day, split into groups of 8, required to wear socks instead of shoes to protect the calcite floor from oil and grit. It is one of the most tightly rationed archaeological sites on Earth, in a country where tourism accounts for roughly 15% of the entire economy. So in 2023 and 2024, a team from UC San Diego's Qualcomm Institute and UC Merced, working with Belize's Institute of Archaeology, and funded partly through a National Science Foundation grant and the Alphawood Foundation, did something nobody had attempted before. They scanned the entire cave, close to 5 kilometers of passage, using mobile LiDAR units, structured light scanners accurate to a fraction of a millimeter, and photogrammetry, stitching it all into what the researchers call a fused, multi-resolution digital twin, with an interactive online version already built and a virtual reality experience still in development. Every crack in the Crystal Maiden's calcite shell, every pot placed by Maya hands over 1,000 years ago, every angle of the chamber that ordinary visitors will never see in person again, preserved in data that can't be dropped, cracked, or worn away by foot traffic. The paper documenting the project is refreshingly honest about why it exists. Tourists have already damaged parts of this site, and the digital scan may be the only way future generations get to study it at all. Here's the strange part. The scan didn't discover a hidden inscription or a secret chamber. It didn't need to. Its purpose was almost the opposite, to freeze a fragile, unrepeatable crime scene in perfect detail before more of it is lost. In a sense, it's the same instinct that drove Kennett to haul a stalagmite out of Yokbalam by headlamp. If the evidence is this rare, this precise, and this easy to destroy, you don't wait. You capture it while you still can. None of this happened in a vacuum, and none of it is free of politics. Every artifact recovered from a Belizean cave, the pots at Carablanca, the bones at Midnight Terror, the 18 bodies at Acton Tunachil Muknal, legally belongs to the government of Belize, managed through the Institute of Archaeology, a division of the National Institute of Culture and History. Most of it never leaves the country. Some sits in a storage vault in the capital, Belmopan, shelves of sealed boxes holding centuries of ritual objects, still waiting for a researcher's attention. Some is displayed at the Museum of Belize in Belize City, opened in 2002 inside a converted colonial-era prison, its centerpiece the replica of the jade head of Kinech Ahau, the sun god, a small, unsettling irony, a nation's most sacred relics, now guarded behind the same walls once used to cage its own people. As of early 2025, the Institute had spent roughly 2 years digitizing the national collection in 3 dimensions, so artifacts too fragile or too sacred to remove from a cave can still be examined without a single object leaving its resting place. That history isn't finished settling. In April 2025, the village of San Benito Puente, built directly atop the ruins of the ancient city of Pusila, formally demanded that the British Museum return Maya human remains, carved stelae, altars, and ceramics taken during British expeditions between 1928 and 1931, along with a proposed repatriation grant worth $1 million Belizean dollars. The British Museum acknowledged the request. As of this recording, it remains under consideration. It's a reminder that the story of Maya collapse isn't only being decided in a lab. It's being decided in the same kind of drawn-out institutional argument that decides who gets to keep the past once the past becomes valuable again. There are real stakes hiding underneath the polite language of under consideration. A national museum that spent nearly a century displaying objects taken during someone else's expedition has a reputation built partly on holding on to them. A small Belizean village demanding their return isn't just asking for property back, it's asking a much larger, wealthier institution to publicly admit that its collection was never fully its own to begin with. Nobody in this story is a cartoon villain. The British Museum didn't invent the drought that killed Pusila, but every side has something to protect: a collection, a nation's cultural inheritance, a scientist's theory, a village's ancestors. The moment the science got sharp enough to say precisely when and how badly the rain failed, it also raised an uncomfortable follow-up question. Who gets to control the story of a civilization once the evidence about its ending becomes this specific, this valuable, and this contested? Not every repatriation story ends in a standoff. In July 2025, more than 150 Maya artifacts returned to Belize after a decade touring the United States as part of an exhibition called Maya: Hidden Worlds Revealed, Alone, Honored, and Closed Cleanly. Proof that these disputes don't have to end bitterly. But the contrast matters. One case shows what cooperation looks like. The other shows what happens when the original removal was never a loan to begin with. So where does that leave the title of this investigation? The claim that a cave discovery in Belize could finally solve why the classic Maya collapsed. The honest answer is more interesting than a clean yes. No single cave solved it. No single stalagmite closed the case. What Yokbalam did, and what the Zabna cores did again in 2025, was give historians something they had never had before: a precise, dated, physical record of exactly when the rain failed, accurate down to the season, sitting right alongside a written record of exactly when the kings stopped fighting long enough to carve their own history into stone. Two independent archives, one written by scribes, one written by dripping water, and they agree with each other far more than anyone expected them to. What the caves refused to do, in the end, is offer a single villain. Not warfare alone, not drought alone, not overpopulation alone. The Maya built an extraordinary civilization on a foundation of good weather that felt permanent. And when that foundation cracked, it exposed every other stress the empire had been carrying in silence: political rivalry, dependence on rain-fed reservoirs, a religious system that promised control over forces it couldn't actually control. The drought was real. The desperation was real. The offerings at Carablanca, the sacrifices at Midnight Terror, the 18 bodies in Aktun Tunachil Muknal, they are not a separate mystery from the stalagmites. They are the same event, recorded twice, once in stone and once in bone. Somewhere in Toledo District, the Yokbalam stalagmite that started this entire reconsideration now sits in a research collection, sliced and sampled, its rings mapped down to individual seasons of rain that fell over the graves of an empire nobody living had ever heard of. It is small enough to hold in two hands. It is precise enough to have rewritten a century of archaeology. Half a mile inside a different mountain, the Crystal Maiden is still exactly where she was left, fused to the floor by the same slow drip that once measured out this civilization's final centuries, visited now by 125 pairs of socked feet 8A, photographed by nobody, mapped in digital detail down to the millimeter, and still, after everything the science has confirmed, not fully explained. The collapse was never one event with one cause. It was dozens of kingdoms, each one running out of margin at almost exactly the same time for reasons a stalagmite could finally date and a skeleton could never fully explain. If you want to see how this investigation keeps unfolding through new scans, new stalagmites, and new disputes over who owns what the caves reveal next, that's exactly the kind of story this channel keeps digging into. So stay close, because somewhere in that chamber, a girl who might be a boy is still waiting on an answer nobody has ever agreed on, and the water is still dripping, one imperceptible layer at a time, writing down whatever comes next.